As Scottish Labour have now admitted that they were wrong to support gender self-ID, should the Scottish and UK governments instruct all institutions to ensure their policies to protect single-sex spaces reflect the actual law?
Elaine, thank you very much indeed. This comes during an industrial tribunal, of course, brought by a Fife nurse who objected to the presence of a transgender doctor in a hospital changing room. Pam Duncan-Glancy, did you get this wrong?
So the question, of course, was should the government now issue guidance and be really clear about what they expect of organisations like the NHS? And this is exactly what we had been asking for all along. The Equality Act should have and does have primacy. Included in that are the protection of single-sex spaces in the legislation around biological sex. We made it really clear that the government should be issuing very clear guidance to all public authorities, because public authorities were telling us they're struggling. They weren't sure what to do.
You voted for gender self-identification. Were you wrong to do that, Pam?
The government failed to issue the guidance that this woman is quite rightly highlighting that was absolutely essential.
Now, hang on a second. Anas Sarwar said he got something wrong. Are you prepared to say you got something wrong?
What Anas Sarwar said yesterday was that when we went in to look at what that particular bill was about and we asked the government for assurances, I sat across from the Cabinet Secretary and other members of the government and asked for assurances around single-sex spaces, around the Equality Act, around the primacy of the Equality Act. The government told us that all of those things would be in place and that the Equality Act would be protected. That has now proven through the courts not to be the case.
Okay.
And what we've seen is organisations like our NHS struggling without the guidance because they need guidance on this stuff so that they can do the right thing by
Dave
everyone
Dugan,
involved.
did the SNP mislead Labour on this then?
Labour's position is lamentable on this. It's beyond parody that the Labour Party would suggest that on a nod and a wink from a Scottish Government minister, they chose not to press any amendments in the Scottish Parliament.
It wasn't a nod and a wink, it was on the record assurances.
Anas Sarwar has declared essentially one of two possible things about his ability to lead the Labour Party in Scotland when he said that he now regrets voting for the GRR bill in the Scottish Parliament. One, he doesn't know how to scrutinise and legislate in the Scottish Parliament and move amendments and press them to a vote. That's one possible outcome. Or the other one is that he changes his mind depending on what the front page of the newspapers are telling him to think. Either way, it's not a very good recommendation or advert for a conviction politician. People, rightly or wrongly, politicians we have the public disagreeing or agreeing with them, never in between, where Anas Sarwar is trying to agree with the last person that he spoke to. It's incorrigible. But I'll tell you what I think, Stephen. Now, I'm a Westminster politician in the House of Commons, so I didn't transact this legislation, but my colleagues did. And colleagues in the Scottish Parliament from across the political spectrum voted for this bill to go through. And I firmly believe, regardless of whatever party they were in, they did it with the ambition of upholding rights and respecting people, regardless of their sex, regardless of their gender, or regardless of whether that gender was acquired or born with them. I think it's a wish beyond anything else that this could get back to a respect agenda, because the heat that is under this is hugely unhelpful. I think if there was, I think when it comes to women-only spaces, I think a lot of people have learned how dearly held that is for an awful lot of women across Scotland and elsewhere. And I don't know that that was hugely or sufficiently understood when this legislation was being transacted. Anas
Sarwar said yesterday, no woman should face disciplinary proceedings for refusing to share a female changing room with a trans person. Is he right?
Well, he'll be saying something different the day after tomorrow, Stephen, because it's Anas Sarwar.
Is he right to say that, though?
Anas Sarwar is rarely right, and I can't say whether he's right on that issue. But I'll tell you something, though, because this is what's really materially important about this issue, is most people, I firmly believe, regardless of what side of this they're coming from, just want to live in harmony with those around them, regardless of their characteristics, and go on with their life.
All right, let me hear from the lady in the third row here, who's nodding. On you go.
I just wanted to agree with that. I think it's important to remember as well that trans women are women. So when we're talking about women-only spaces, trans women, they're men.
Sue Webber? Well, actually, hang on a second. Let's just concentrate on the little debate that's going on between the two of you there. You asked the question about this. What do you think of what you've heard so far?
So there's a lot going over old history here, but certainly Labour knew what they were getting into. They just chose to ignore it. They were warned from many women's groups the detail of this bill would mean that it was an erosion of single-sex spaces for women. All other parties, Dave, you were saying all other parties voted for it. All other parties, apart from the Tories, were whipped to vote for it. You might remember that one. And it's led to the institutional capture throughout the country, not just Scotland, but in the UK, that means that people are saying trans women are women and we have to accept that as face value. If you're trans, you're a male. If you're a trans woman, you're a male. That's how you start in life.
Okay.
And women, it's not for us to decide who we might be uncomfortable with. We want our single-sex spaces to stay.
I will come back to this, but let me just give you a chance to respond to that. Lady next to you, go on.
It's interesting your word choice there, that it's not up to us to decide. Exactly, it's not up to us to decide to affirm a gender to someone when that is not the gender that they believe that they are. That's just not our place. And I have to say as well, as a woman, it is not trans women that frighten me or intimidate me at all. It's not necessarily men, it's individuals, it's not a group of people.
Right. Let me bring this back to the panel. That phrase, organisational capture, which Elaine just used there, Anna Sarwar used that phrase yesterday as well. Has that been going on in Scotland, do you think?
I think there's been a presumption. You saw it with the prison service 2 years ago with Isla Bryson as well. And again, this seems to be reflected in the NHS, that there was a presumption that Nicola Sturgeon's gender self-ID bill was going to pass. And they have then implemented policies and protocols and approaches to whatever they want to do in the decisions they make in their organisations to fulfil that legislation. There is only one man in this Parliament at that time that had any idea about the equality legislation, and that was Alistair Jack. When he stopped the gender self-ID legislation from going through using his Section 30, he has saved even further embarrassment for Scotland. We spoke about how the Scottish Government can't do legislation, or Labour can't scrutinise legislation in Parliament. The SNP have not got a particularly good reputation for bringing forward half-decent legislation either. We've had the deposit return scheme, the hate crime bill and the self-ID. It goes on and on and on. I think we really need to look critical at ourselves. And, you know, I've been in the changing room in Kirkcaldy Hospital in Fife, and there is not a safe space or a private space to go as a woman that may be having the issues that nurse was facing. These are not places with cubicles. They are not places. They are just square rooms with lockers and benches. And I think you have to have a secure, single-sex space for women when they're going about their life and their job.
John Edward.
One of the things that amazes me about this entire discussion is this division that we have just seen, both in the audience and in the panel. The idea that somehow your party membership will define what you think about this kind of thing. It seems to me to be a simple matter of well-being and safeguarding. In schools, that's all they care about, is making sure that children are made to feel comfortable and not made to feel threatened in any way. And if there are issues, and I used to work in education, when there were issues with kids who were transitioning or whatever it might be, then it was an issue dealt with as an individual case. And it strikes me that we've allowed this, if never mind institutional capture, it seems to have become ideological capture. So it's a flag that people can wave to show they're on one side of an argument or another. That's not to disallow either argument, but it's to say that surely there's got to be a more serious discussion about welfare. If I think when I went to school, you know, communal showers, communal toilets, all this kind of stuff, they would be completely impossible now because things have moved on. And it is perfectly clear from the debate here this evening and all the way past that we're going to have to change some of the ways in which we treat what people expect when they are treated in public services and elsewhere. I don't see that's necessarily hugely difficult if we're spending billions on building prisons and hospitals and schools. Surely we can have that discussion about what is right for people individually, rather than saying, because you think this way, we all must go that way until the election changes. I've never understood why this has to be an issue of politics rather than an issue of practicality.
Sandy Begbie, you've worked at the highest level in HR. How do we find an accommodation between women's rights and transgender rights?
So I think, I mean, I've read the case like everyone else, and I think I've been struck by, I think, a couple of things that John says. One is the ideological debate around it, and also the political polarisation around it. I mean, you're right, Stephen. I mean, I worked in HR for many, many years and dealt with an increasingly complex workplace from a whole range of different angles, and that's over the last 25 years. But the bottom line is what many organisations do will aim to create a workplace where everyone can come and feel safe in the workplace and can be themselves. But there is a legal requirement to provide single-sex spaces for women in the workplace. What I find in offices I go into, in members of ours, in terms of, for example, in terms of toilets, you will have male, female, and you will have facilities for anyone. And you'll have those three. And actually, that's the way that most companies have dealt with it. It's pragmatic, it's sensible. It might not be 100% right, but actually it deals with the particular challenges. The workplace these days is extremely complex. There is no shadow of doubt about it. But the reality is there's law that will guide you. And what I find interesting about the case is, and it was in the papers at the weekend, is it would appear that legal advice was provided that clearly indicated that in this case, NHS Health were not complying with their legal requirements. And that's the way I read it. And that simply, to me, as an HR professional, is not acceptable.
Neil Gray said today that he has full confidence in NHS Fife management. Do you, Dave Dugan?
Well, I'm not going to prejudge how the tribunal is going to come out, and Neil Gray will know the management team on the NHS Fife NHS board in a way that I don't, Stephen, so it's not for me to say. But and I came on tonight specifically saying that I wouldn't talk about the situation in Fife because I don't think it's appropriate given the ongoing tribunal that's affecting those people.
There's no legal reason you can't.
No, there isn't a legal reason, Stephen, but there are people, real people, involved in this case, not just the two protagonists that are making the headlines, but the staff who have, I'm certain, went to work that day to do a good job and to do right by people, and they now find themselves in the headlines. People like me are in the newspapers all the time, and we enter that situation willingly. People who go and do a job for the Health Board do not expect to find themselves on the front page of the newspapers or in the TV news, and I've got more respect for those people than to talk about their situation on here.